Welcome to Lecture 2 of Bio 121 Human Biology and Evolution. We're going to be talking about the paleo lifestyle. But before we begin, I would like to direct you to D2L's content browser, and you should see a document titled Lecture 2 Cues. And that brings up some worksheets and these are meant to be questions that guide you through lecture, highlighting the key points. But before we begin today, I have this pre-lecture portion I would like you to fill out. It asks you to please record everything you ate in the past 24 hours. This is meant to provide information about the variety of foods you normally consume. So I'll give you a moment to find that in D2L and jot down your responses, and you may want to pause this video. Once you've had a moment to record all of the different foods you may have eaten in the last 24 hours, next, down at the bottom where I've highlighted here, it says your instructor will tell you what to do next. I'm hoping you can count the number of different types of plants you've eaten in the last 24 hours and also the different number of animals. So like for me, I ate chicken and eggs, so that's still just chicken, so that's like one type of animal in the last 24 hours. Plants, I've eaten carrots and broccoli and spinach, and the list goes on, so you can tally up the number of plants you've eaten. And then also write down how many hours of sleep you got last night. We're going to sit on this information, but it will become clear why I had you record that in the lecture. Today's lecture is called the Paleo Lifestyle, and here's a picture of some people who are living the paleo lifestyle. These are San Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert. You see women with children. They're sitting around a fire where they're roasting tubers, like they're not potatoes, but they're a type of tuber, same variety of plant root. And these are people who are living the same lifestyle as all of our ancestors used to live before the invention of agriculture. In my love of metacognition activities, here are your 3 questions to get you started today. So take a minute to write these down on a piece of scratch paper, record what you already know about. Number 1, what is a hunter-gatherer and how do they live? Number 2, how did our ancestors live throughout most of humanity's evolutionary history? And 3, have humans evolved in the last 10,000 years? If so, in what ways? I'm counting on you to pause the video if you need more time to jot down what you already know. So I'm going to continue to the next slide, but feel free to take as long as you want. From 1.8 million years ago, when humans first stepped foot on this earth, until agriculture was invented 10,000 years ago, humans lived as hunter-gatherers. This is the majority of our species' history. 1,790,000 years living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. That's a long time, and especially it's a long time to live in one way and then to only switch in the last 10,000 years to a very different way of living. Today's lecture is going to contrast our modern lifestyle with the lifestyle of hunter-gatherers. And there seems to be a mismatch. We have inherited genes from our ancient ancestors who lived as hunter-gatherers. So these are genes that benefited our hunter-gatherer ancestors, and they no longer fit the challenges of our modern world. So the mismatch is between our ancient genes and the modern environment. The nutritional needs of today's humans arose through a multi-million year evolutionary process during nearly all of which genetic change reflected the life circumstances of our ancestral species. But since the appearance of agriculture 10,000 years ago, and especially since the Industrial Revolution, genetic adaptation has been unable to keep pace with cultural progress. Natural selection has produced only minor alterations during the past 10,000 years, so we remain nearly identical genetically to our late Paleolithic ancestors. This mismatch between our ancient genes and our ancient bodies versus the modern environment and the circumstances we live in today, we think contributes to chronic disease prevalence. For example, in the US, 65% of adults over age 20 are either overweight or obese, and this can have downstream health consequences. Over 64 million people have one or more types of cardiovascular disease, which accounts for nearly 40% of all deaths here in the US. 50 million people have high blood pressure, and I am one of them. Over 29 million people have type 2 diabetes. This is typically associated with older ages, like both of my parents eventually developed type 2 diabetes in their 50s. But many people under age 20 have type 2 diabetes as well. 37 million people have high cholesterol, and I was one of them until I made a drastic change in my diet and went vegan. And cancer causes about a quarter of all deaths in this country. And scientists think that about a third of cancer deaths are due to nutrition-related factors, including obesity. So, with this information, there has been a modern movement to understand why our bodies are reacting this way, why our health is suffering. And it has to do with the modern environment contrasting the paleo environment in which our bodies evolved through natural selection. So here are a bunch of popular books and TV shows that exist. The Paleo Diet, the Paleo Manifesto, Neanderthal. It seems to be a fad, so I wanted to present some data that actually back this up. So let's take a moment to contrast a typical hunter-gatherer lifestyle, which anthropologists have gone out and observed and recorded data on what modern hunter-gatherers actually live like. And we can contrast that to our modern Western American lifestyles. So compared to a typical hunter-gatherer, we exercise less. Maybe you've seen this image before, all these people going to the gym, but they're not going up the stairs, they're taking the escalator. We sleep less. We eat more of sugar, fat, and salt, but we eat less of other things like fiber, potassium, and many other vitamins. And the type of meat that we eat is typically farmed instead of wild caught or hunted. Here comes the data. Here is a plot of daily activity levels for one group of modern hunter-gatherers called the Hadza. They live in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a picture of some men hunting with bows and arrows that they crafted themselves. And the guy in the middle who's hunched over is tracking footsteps. The data you see on the plot is hours spent walking around per day by age. And these are individuals who wore something like a Fitbit. And they were tracked by the scientists. So the pluses represent individual men in this society, and the filled in circles represent individual women. And you can see it goes from age 0, so babies, all the way up to the eldest elders of their population who are approaching 80 years old. And then there are some lines which take the average of all individuals in a certain age class. And what we see is that the lines peak around age 19 years for both the men and the women. And if we looked at their daily travel, in this population, women are walking between 5 and 6 kilometers a day on average. So some days they do more, some days they do less. And men a little bit more, 8.3 kilometers per day. And I invite you to think about why this peaks around age 19 years. And if we were in class, we could have a fun discussion about this. So on lecture online, it's kind of weird. I'll just give away the answer. So this is the age at first birth. So people in this society form partnerships and have children, and first children are born around age 19. And so the more children you have, the hours you spend walking around for both men and women starts to decline. And you can see the steep decline in the women's curve, which is the solid line through the circles. So that's kind of fun. The next trend on my list on a previous slide was that we eat more sugar. So let's examine the types of sugar in our diet, and one way to do that is by measuring the glycemic index of different foods. The glycemic index is a physiological measure of the way your blood sugar levels respond after you eat a particular type of food. Lower glycemic index numbers are considered better because it might take the same amount of energy but release it into your body more slowly over time, delivering the glucose you need to fuel your body for a longer period of time instead of just releasing it all at once. So what you see on the graph here in red are high glycemic index food, and you can see the blood sugar level is spiked in the red, and then it crashes. And then you would need to eat more food to bring the blood sugar back up to a healthy level. But the yellow line under it is something more even. It may be delivering the same amount of calories, but it's more moderated. So it's releasing a little bit of sugar over a longer duration of time, and that keeps your blood sugar level even, so you're not spiking and crashing. Low glycemic index foods are things like whole grains or raw fish. Sushi probably has a very low glycemic index depending on how much rice is involved. Yams are typically low glycemic index foods, and these contrast higher glycemic index foods that have a lot of refined sugar, like baked goods and breads and fruit juice. To get the point across and to contrast the glycemic index of typical foods we might eat in our modern lifestyles, contrasting that with a hunter-gatherer group, I'll give you a minute to look at the glycemic index of these popular foods. So like watermelon, ice cream, mashed potatoes, macaroni. So all of these glycemic indices range, it looks like, between 37 and 81, and they typically tend to be in like the high 60s maybe on average. How do you think that compares to typical foods eaten by Australian Aborigines? Notice that these glycemic indices are much, much lower. So the typical foods eaten by this group of hunter-gatherers have a lower glycemic index than we experience in the US. You get the point. Here are some glycemic indices of common foods that can be found under normal circumstances in the grocery store. The ones on the left are refined foods that have higher glycemic indices, and the ones on the right could be our modern equivalent of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So these are boiled brown rice, whole fruits and vegetables. These tend to be things that are intact foods that were grown and harvested. So an entire apple, not just the apple juice. And the things on the right tend to be processed foods, things you buy in packaging that were created in a lab to taste good. We also eat more fat and less protein than typical hunter-gatherers. Here is a data table showing 4 different years where scientists went out and studied what people were eating in a hunter-gatherer tribe. This data comes from sub-Saharan Africa, and you can contrast it with the modern US numbers over on the right. And what we see is the percentage of the diet. So this is a percentage of caloric intake that was comprised of these 3 macronutrients: proteins, carbohydrates, and fat. And what we see is in the 4 hunter-gatherer years, they typically ate more protein than we do in the US, and less of their diet came from carbs and fat. Now here is where I'd like you to look back at your notes from the beginning of lecture. Take a look at your tallies for the total number of plants and the total number of animals you ate in the last 24 hours. Next, extrapolate that out to an entire year. Total, how many different types of animals, for example, did you eat in the last year? I don't mind sharing with you my number. Let's see, I eat chicken and turkey and beef and pork and probably 3 or 4 different types of fish, and lamb if I'm lucky. So that's 9, maybe 10 different types of animals in my average year. 10 is a much smaller number than we see here among the hunter-gatherers. Even in 1985, which was a difficult year for this group of people, they ate 21 different types of animals. It goes up from there, and look, in 1997, they ate 85 different types of animals. That is a very large number compared to what I'm used to here in the US. Next, if we look at the different numbers of plants eaten, I didn't write down the number of plants I think I eat in a typical year, but I bet it's less than 44, and I know it's less than 236. The point is that our diet is less varied than the diet of hunter-gatherers. That is partly due to necessity. Hunter-gatherers go out in search of food every day. They don't have refrigerators or grocery stores, so whatever they happen across in their environment, if it's edible, they're going to eat it. That means they take advantage of whatever plants are in season and whatever animals they can catch. A result of this flexibility in diet is that because they have such a variety, they get more varied nutritional content. So as you might imagine, each plant produces its own mix of vitamins and minerals. So if you rely on just one type of plant and you eat that plant every day, you're going to have a lot of whatever that plant gives you, but you might be lacking the vitamins and minerals that that plant happens not to make. So hunter-gatherers, when they're eating lots of different types of plants, they're getting a broader variety of nutrition. That contrasts many American diets where we rely on fewer different types of foods, and therefore whatever those foods happen to be lacking, we end up being short in. Next on the list of comparisons, I mentioned that the type of food we eat is typically farmed. And farmed meat has a different nutrient profile than wild caught game. Here is a data table comparing the lipid composition, that's the fat composition of muscle tissue from different types of animals, from giraffes, Cape buffalo. These are things that you can't get in the grocery store. And then there are some things that are found in the US that you could hunt. So white-tailed deer, pronghorn, elk. And then at the very bottom, there are 2 cattle Examples, there's grain-fed steer, which is like regular beef you'd get at the grocery store, and then there's grass-fed beef right above it. And so what the columns of numbers are showing you is saturated fat, monounsaturated fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, an omega-6 to an omega-3 ratio, and we know that omega-3s are important for brain development and healthy neuron function, especially in developing brains, like in children. And then the last column is PUFA to saturated fat ratio. So polyunsaturated fats, which are considered healthier, to saturated fat ratio, and saturated fat dietary content has been linked to heart disease. So PUFAs are generally considered healthier than saturated fats, and for this omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, we want the number to be lower because that will mean more omega-3s. And what we see here at the bottom, highlighted with this red box, is that grain-fed steer, which is the typical beef available to us in the grocery store, if we don't pony up to pay the extra fee for the grass-fed, it has higher saturated fat, it has fewer omega-3s, and so it has a different effect on cardiovascular health than these other types of foods. And if you compare that to a giraffe, well, the giraffe has really high PUFAs, low saturated fat, and an intermediate omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. We also eat more salt, which is called sodium on nutrition labels, and we eat less potassium and many other types of vitamins than do hunter-gatherers. So in the bottom, I've shown this sodium and potassium numbers. Typical hunter-gatherers informed this Paleolithic intake estimate in the first column, where we have a little bit of sodium and a whole lot of potassium. The U.S. daily recommended allowance is in the middle column, but what people are actually eating is in the column all the way to the right where it says current U.S. intake. So you can see that we have a lot more sodium in our diets than do hunter-gatherers, and we have a lot less potassium. And this is a result of eating more food products that come off the shelves in the middle part of the grocery store and less fresh produce. So hunter-gatherers, you can imagine, they only eat fresh products. They don't have refrigerators. They don't have grocery stores. And so these differences in our diet yield these big differences in sodium and potassium intake. We also eat a lot less fiber. And over time, this can have drastic health impacts. So foods with less fiber tend to have higher glycemic index, for one thing. And you can contrast the numbers. So the Paleolithic intake informed by modern hunter-gatherer diets is 104 grams of fiber per day. And I invite you as an experiment to just one day tally up the number of grams of fiber you get per day. And it won't be anywhere near 104. I'm betting. I mentioned previously the relationship between fiber and glycemic index. This graph shows you that relationship. So you can see different dots representing the glycemic index versus the fiber content of a lot of typical foods. And you can see as fiber increases, glycemic index declines. So over on the right we have acorns, which is a classic example of something that's very high in fiber and very low in glycemic index. You can contrast that with corn on the left, which has relatively less fiber than these other traditional foods and therefore has a higher glycemic index. Processed foods, sometimes called refined carbohydrates, are the classic example of something that has a very high glycemic index because the fiber has purposefully been removed. Food scientists learned that removing fiber lengthens the shelf life of the food product. So fiber is a part of the grain that deteriorates, it goes rancid and tastes bad relatively quickly. So if you wash that off of the grain, turning something that's whole wheat into something like whole wheat flour into white flour, you just remove the fiber, the shelf life is improved. So these are things like pasta, white breads. So what has this to do with health? This would be an excellent final presentation topic if you were interested in digging deeper into this subject. But I just wanted to include one example. So we talked about glycemic index and the spike it has, these high glycemic index foods on your blood sugar level. Well, it turns out that when your blood sugar spikes, if you are someone who produces insulin, which you are unless you're diabetic, it causes an insulin spike in your body as well. And when insulin spikes, this is mimicking your body's natural response to infection. It can damage blood vessels, leading to atherosclerosis. It's been linked to certain types of cancers and to cognitive decline in the elderly. And so to try to prevent these long-term health consequences, it's thought that we should prevent insulin spikes by remaining healthy and eating lower glycemic index foods. Nevertheless, even though I know all of these details, because my body is the product of evolution by natural selection, my ancient genes that I inherited from my ancestors make me crave things that used to be scarce in their hunter-gatherer environment. Things high in fat, high in salt, and high in sugar are so rare that the people in the population that craved them and maybe put forth a little extra effort to go out and seek maybe meat that is higher in fat content than plants, or that sought natural sources of salt and sugar, which are really, really rare in the environment before modern times. Those are the people that had marginally better nutrition, leading to better health, and they're the ones who passed on more genes to the next generation. That happened over 1.8 million years of evolution, leading to all of us. So we are the product of ancestors who experienced fat, salt, and sugar in scarcity in their environments. So this is what my hunter-gatherer genes crave, even though in today's world it's no longer scarce and it's easy to get my hands on a cheeseburger if that's what I want. And that mismatch, we think, imposes some health consequences. From about 10,000 years ago, lifestyles began changing with the advent of agriculture. And if we think about this in terms of evolution, a generation is about 20 years. Then 10,000 years is approximately 500 generations. While this is a blink of an eye in the evolutionary history of our species, 500 generations is still enough time to accumulate some genetic changes as a result of this change in the environment. And it turns out there is evidence that a few highly advantageous genes have evolved in just the past 10,000 years since the invention of agriculture. Agriculture led to new environments and new challenges, such that when mutations popped up that were beneficial in this new environment, they were maintained through natural selection in certain parts of the world. Here I've shown archaeological artifacts that have been recovered from the desert in modern day Mesopotamia. And this is one of the first places in the world that we have archaeological evidence for agriculture. And this Mesopotamia is shown here in green. It's in modern day Iraq, Syria, southern Turkey, the north of Saudi Arabia. It's between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers here. And this was climatically good for growing whatever was there, and what happened to be there was wheat. But in other places of the world around the same time, due to global climate change, the world was coming out of an ice age. So around this time, agriculture was invented independently in several different regions. Here in North America, corn was created by artificially selecting a native plant called teosinte, shown on the left. And through many generations of purposefully breeding plants together to get desired outcomes in the offspring, maize was produced, the corn that we eat today. Sorghum was artificially selected and grown and harvested for food in sub-Saharan Africa. Rice in southeastern Asia. Wheat, as I said, in Mesopotamia. Potatoes in the Andes Mountains of modern-day Peru and northern Chile. Taro in many different Polynesian islands. So people were taking advantage of the plants that were native in their local environments, and they were learning to plant them and artificially select them on purpose to produce harvest crops. Here's another map, and you can look at where in the world your favorite foods come from. Like if you love asparagus, you can see that that comes from southeastern Europe. All my favorite things come from Central America. Cacao, chili peppers, avocados, yes. And it's not just plants. Animals were domesticated around this time too. And we think this is true because hunter-gatherers who move around a lot, they have to chase food, not just food on foot, but where plants happen to be fruiting. So they're moving around a lot. But with the advent of agriculture, people stopped moving around so much, and they set up permanent settlements near their fields. And when they did that, the archaeological evidence suggests they started tending animals as well. So you can see where your favorite animals were originally domesticated. As I said on a previous slide, there is genetic and archaeological evidence that suggests agriculture indeed produced evolutionary change in humans in just the last 10,000 years. And you'll read details about this in the textbook reading assigned for this week, and you'll study this one, lactase persistence, in detail in this unit's lab activities. The ability to produce lactase into adulthood allows people to digest dairy. So lactase is an enzyme produced inside your intestines that helps break down the sugar found in milk products. The sugar is called lactose. The enzyme that breaks it down for you is called lactase. And all mammals, when they're born, can produce this enzyme. It allows them to take advantage of the sugar found in their mother's milk, because that's how mammal babies eat. But after weaning, mammals typically stop producing this enzyme. which makes sense because there's no other source of that sugar except for milk. So if you're done drinking milk, you don't need the enzyme anymore. Turns out humans are special among mammals because some of us, unfortunately not including me, but many humans on Earth can produce this enzyme for their whole lives after infancy. And this is typically an ability that traces back to ancestry, to a group of people that were some of the original domesticators of dairy animals. Genetic evidence suggests that this ability to continue producing the lactase enzyme independently evolved 3 times in 3 separate lineages, but the thing they had in common is they all kept varying types of dairy animals. So I invite you to study more about that by doing the lab activity assigned for this unit. Another example of an agricultural induced evolution is the ability to digest gluten. Gluten tolerance is made possible by a number of different genes that produce enzymes that digest gluten for you. And that just means that it breaks down the gluten into building blocks that your intestines can absorb and get nutrition from. So otherwise the gluten just passes through and you don't get any nutrition from it. The ability to digest gluten is a product of natural selection among groups that domesticated plants that have gluten, and wheat is the plant that has gluten. So if you can digest gluten, you have your ancient ancestors to thank, at least one of whom probably came from somewhere on Earth that wheat was domesticated in. A third example that you can read about in the textbook in more detail is tuberculosis resistance. It turns out that some people have a genetic protection mechanism against tuberculosis infection. And this is common among populations who have a long history of living with animals that can carry tuberculosis. TB is considered a zoonotic disease, meaning it can pass from animals to infect people. So tuberculosis resistance genes, scientists think, evolved in populations where people lived in close proximity to their animals. If this were a normal in-class lecture, I would pause here and invite everyone to read the case study for this unit, which is called Paleo Lifestyle, and then we would discuss it in person. So instead, please read it on your own and contribute to the ongoing discussion posts in D2L so we can have a virtual discussion about it together. And I look forward to reading your reflections on that case study. Okay, that's the end of lecture, so please don't shut the window yet and take out your scrap paper that you originally recorded your responses to these questions and see if you gained any understanding about what is a hunter-gatherer and how do they live, how did our ancestors live throughout most of humanity's evolutionary history, and have humans evolved in the last 10,000 years. I hope that you have something to add to your original list, because that means my job here is done and I was able to share a little bit of new information with you, which is my goal every week. So thanks for listening to Lecture 2. The end.